This is part 3 of my series covering the Warhammer 40k lore iceberg. Usually I'd spend a bit more time on the intro, but there really isn't much point in doing that here. The Tau being uplifted by the Eldar is kind of an in-universe conspiracy theory. As far as I can tell, it comes from Xenology, which was published when I was a literal infant, and was structured as the beliefs and interpretations of Imperial scholars, who obviously didn't have as much information on every faction as we the players do. All of which is to say that you shouldn't take anything from the book without an absolute mountain of salt, including this theory. Basically, the gist of it is that the queens of a different Xenos race, one of whom was captured by the Eldar, have a diamond-shaped organ that supposedly allows them to control the rest of their species, and the Tau Ethereals have a similarly shaped organ in their brain, allowing them to do the same thing. Ergo, perhaps the Ethereals were bioengineered by the Eldar for some reason. It's a fun theory, but most likely not true. Tuska Demon-Killa is an Ork warboss who led a war into the Eye of Terror in search of demons to fight. And obviously he found many. Eventually, Tuska and his boys were killed by a Khornate Demon Prince called the Blood Prince. Not before stabbing him in the cock, apparently, but Khorne himself was so impressed by the sheer fightiness of the Orks that he took them all into his own domain, where they fight eternally at the gates of the Brass Citadel. Everyone involved is, presumably, very happy with this arrangement. The new men are Fabius Bile's answer to Space Marines, a bioengineered subrace of humanity who are stronger, faster, and smarter than normal. One of them even went toe-to-toe with Alpha Primus, who is basically every chapter of Space Marines stuffed into one slightly oversized Primaris body. Bile hopes that one day they'll take over from humanity, as the true rulers of the galaxy, and has been secretly seeding them on Imperial worlds for, a while, at least a few months. During the Great Crusade, Orks were generally much more numerous and well organised, with larger empires spanning hundreds of worlds, and much better equipment, technology and tactics than their modern-day equivalents. One of these empires, centred on Ulanor, was such a threat to the newborn Imperium that Emps himself, along with his trusted son Horus, who he brought because he knew he would never betray him, personally led a massive crusade against the Greenskins. One of the Orks there, not even the leader, just a random war boss, almost killed Big E. Though, to be fair, he might have just been pretending to make Horus feel good about saving him. It's unclear. Suffice to say, Ghazghkull could never. I'm not falling for this one again, you can Google it yourselves. Rogal Dorn apparently died, off-screen, after his ship was overrun by Chaos cultists, with his hand being the only piece of his body that was recovered. In early lore, his whole skeleton was found, but now it's just his hand, which is kept aboard the Phalanx for everyone to look longingly at. Obviously, this seems like a bit of an anticlimactic end for a Primarch, so the running theory is that he didn't actually die, and just wandered off to return later, like almost all of the other Loyalist Primarchs, come to think of it. The exact origins of the Tyranids is a mystery, and it's likely to remain that way. We know that they came to the Milky Way at some point after the 31st millennium, and that they were drawn towards it by the Pharaoh's device blasting a signal into the void between galaxies. There is evidence of Tyranids being in the Milky Way before that, to be fair, but never in super large numbers like there are now. We don't know which galaxy they came from, or how they evolved, or really what's going on outside of the Milky Way at all, to be honest. The Olamic Quietude were a human civilization found by the Space Wolves during the Great Crusade, who considered themselves the true successors of humanity and the Imperium to be imposters, which predictably led to war between them and the Good Boys. The Quietude's unique gimmick was that they replaced almost their entire body with bionics, leaving only the brain, skull and spinal cord intact. Shame they met the Wolves rather than the Iron Hands, really. The Thyrrus are possibly the most 40k thing imaginable, and it's absolutely criminal how little focus they get in the setting. Basically, they're alien squids who see war as a performative art, and therefore their tactics and technology are designed around being as bombastic and showy as possible, rather than bothering with such pointless concepts as victory or defeat. Basically, they live their lives the same way I play actual games of 40k. Warhammer 40k 1st edition, known at the time as Rogue Trader, was, well, the first edition of Warhammer 40k, released in 1987. It was a bit odd when compared to modern 40k. Everything was obviously a lot less fleshed out, and the tone was overall a fair bit more whimsical. while still being more depressing than the modern lore in some areas. In fact, I made a whole video on it a while back. I'll link that here if I remember. This is, as far as I can make out, a reference to old fanfictions written on 4chan. The most well-known of which are Love Can Bloom about a Vindicare assassin and Eldar Farseer, and Warhammer High, where the teenage daughters of the Primarchs are attending school together. Not really my thing, but if you like that sort of stuff, then more power to you. Jaghatai's fate following the heresy is very similar to Dorn's. About 70 years after the Siege of Terror, he chased a Dark Eldar raiding party through a webway portal, and hasn't been seen since. Presumably he's still there, but nobody really knows for sure. He'll probably be back at some point in the future, but I imagine he'd be one of the last Primarchs to return, just based solely on the relative lack of popularity of the White Scars. The Krorks are to Orks as pre-Age of Strife humanity is to the Imperium. Created by the Old Ones as soldiers for the War in Heaven, the Krorks were larger, smarter, more organised and more technologically advanced than the race they would eventually devolve into. To put them into perspective a bit, the Beast, leader of a war so powerful that it required Vulcan himself to rock up and personally save the Imperium, was about 10 metres tall and wore more or less standard Orc wargear. The Krork in Trazin's collection is 12 metres tall and wears armour that was as sophisticated as Astartes' plate, and there's no indication that he was a warbot or anything. He could have been their equivalent of a boy. If they ever came back, it would be bad news for basically everyone in the galaxy. The Enslavers are a Xenos race native to the Warp, as in they live in the Warp, but I don't think they're demons. I'm not entirely clear on how they work exactly. As the name suggests, they're able to mind control the members of other races into doing their bidding. Their bidding usually being to turn the individual into a warp gate in order to allow other enslavers to enter the material universe. All in all, quite horrifying. No thank you. In Rogue Trader, and a certain parody series on YouTube, Custodes were depicted as looking like this, before they were changed to look more or less how they do now, somewhere around 2nd edition. The in-universe explanation for the change was that following the Emperor's fall during the heresy, the Custodes renounced their golden armour, instead choosing to be naked but for their cloaks, loincloths and black helms, as a way of marking their shame for failing their dad. I don't tend to tear my shirt off to reveal my perfectly chiselled and oiled up physique every time I make a mistake, but different strokes I suppose. Following the birth of Slaanesh and the fall of the Eldar pantheon, Nurgle rescued the Eldar goddess of rejuvenation, trapping her in his basement and using her as a test subject for all his plagues, as she can cure herself of any of Nurgle's diseases. A rather horrifying existence, certainly, though on the bright side, she is at least able to whisper to mortals the cures for each of the plagues. A group of Eldar did once try to rescue her, but they were swiftly turned into trees that now decorate Nurgle's garden, conveniently placed so that the goddess can still hear their screams. A cute little theory that I'm rather partial to is that Isha is the Tree of Life that Leman Russ entered the Warp in search of. The Kaban Machine was the name of an artificially intelligent robot created by Master Adept Lucas Crom during the Great Crusade, despite the ban on AI by Big E. As you might expect, the guy who was really into making an evil robot creature wasn't a huge fan of Emps, and the Kaban Machine played a key role in supporting the Dark Mechanicum on Mars during the Horus Heresy. Obi-Wan Sherlock Clouseau is a shining example of what I said earlier about the tone of early 40k being a bit more whimsical. He was an example Inquisitor from the original Rogue Trader rulebook, and was named after my girlfriend's crush, a Victorian drug addict, and that one guy from the Pink Panther. What the Primarchs actually are is something we're probably never going to get a straight answer to. What we do know is that there was a not insignificant amount of warpcraft going on with their creation, and that it's their souls that are responsible for their sheer power level, more than any amount of genetic engineering. I personally like this idea, that each of the Primarchs are the physical avatar of a certain emotional concept contained within the Warp, though there are countless differing theories as to what's going on with the Emperor's giant kids. Nobody knows what's going on with Cypher. In fact, I'm not convinced that Cypher knows what's going on with Cypher. Whoever he is, and it's almost certain he isn't the last guy we saw holding the title during the fall of Caliban, he's been knocking about the galaxy for at least 10,000 years, popping up every now and then to kill a planetary governor, loyalist space marine, chaos space marine, inquisitor, or chaos cult leader. As I said, it's far from clear-cut what he's actually doing, and as with many things that are ambiguous, it has spawned a lot of crackpot theories about what's really going on. My favourite one of which is that he's a mirror of Percival in Arthurian myth, who will find the Holy Grail and use it to heal the Fisher King, in this case the Emperor of Man. I made an entire video about Arthurian legend and how it relates to the Dark Angels. If you're curious about that, I imagine you can find a link floating about somewhere. This is an interesting little theory, and I'm honestly not sure whether I'd prefer it to be true or false. Basically, the idea is that the Corpse Emperor, as in the actual physical body strapped into the Golden Throne, is actually just a corpse. That he died from his wounds at some point after the heresy, and the 1,000 psychers a day that the Imperium have been feeding the Golden Throne are solely responsible for keeping the lights on and the webway portal on Terra shut. The God Emperor, as in the actual warp presence responsible for the living saints and such, is, therefore, purely a creation of the Imperium's worship of said corpse, and actually contains nothing of the true Emperor within it. As I said, an interesting little idea. This one is surprisingly far down the iceberg, considering it has its own mini for one of the more popular Space Marine subfactions. But who am I to argue with the man giving me free content? The Sanguinor was originally a member of the Sanguinary Guard, chosen to become the Herald of Sanguinius during the Imperium Secundus, in order to spare the real Sanger from the horrors of public speaking. Later, as Sanger, Robert and Lionel were attempting to reach Terra, the Herald sacrificed himself to rescue his dad from a demon, being consumed by the warp in the process. Since then, the Sanguinor has appeared on various battlefields to fight alongside the Blood Angels in their times of greatest need, and wages an eternal battle in the warp with the Black Angel, the embodiment of the Black Rage. He also had a chat with Dante once, which is like the only time he's spoken since the heresy. Doombreed was the first human Demon Prince of Khorne, created on Earth long before the unification of humanity. Who he originally was is never stated outright, just that he was a mighty warlord who led armies which ravaged entire nations on Terra, somewhere around M1 or 2, and that he was responsible for genocide and murder on such a grand scale that he drew the attention of a relatively young Khorne. Based on that description, he could be any number of people throughout history, though Genghis Khan probably fits the description the best. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure what this one is trying to imply. Belisarius Cawl is certainly untrustworthy, and is definitely a heretic despite what he tells himself, but he seems quite loyal to both the Imperium and to Guilliman personally. I suppose it could be a reference to how the Cawl Inferior keeps asking Guilliman to be made Fabricator General, despite ostensibly being a copy of Cawl himself, who is staunchly against the idea, but I'm really not sure. If anyone has any better ideas, please let me know in the comments. If you've been paying attention so far, you'll remember I mentioned a huge orc known as the Beast earlier in the video. What I didn't mention was that the Beast was actually one of 6 so-called Prime Orks, hugely powerful and intelligent war bosses who each commanded one of the Orc clans among their war during its invasion of the Imperium. The Rangda, also known as the Rangdan Cerebvors or Rangdan Ossivores, were a Xenos species encountered during the Great Crusade, known to use vast legions of slave armies in battle, and who were the titular antagonists of the Rangdan Xenocides, a series of bloody wars that possibly have something to do with the disappearances of one or both of the lost legions. The Slaw are a separate race of horrifying maggot men who feast on the brains of the dead, and who had a habit of following the wake of the Rangdan fleets, harvesting anything they found. The Crave are more or less the 40k equivalent of vampires, who also eat brains, are known to use hordes of slave organisms, and come from the same region of space as the other 2 races mentioned. The same region of space that spawned the Pale Wasting, a mysterious event involving that which cannot die, and which wiped out 11 entire Space Marine chapters. Because of the similarities between the 3 races, and how they all came from the same area of space, I think that the Rangda, Crave, and the other guys who I can't even begin to figure out the pronunciation of, are all simply different names for the same species, who massed some form of undead host against the Imperium, but were ultimately pushed back. It's genuinely mental to me that this is on the same level as the Sanguinor. The only reference to Cog-whisperers I could find comes from an expansion book for the Rogue Trader RPG, which labels them as those who believe they can talk directly with machine spirits, or see astral projections of the machines themselves that lead them away from danger, or warn them of imminent malfunctions. It's unclear whether they're telling the truth, or whether they're just mental, but the Admech definitely don't like it, seeking to suppress the children of the Cogs, with any tech priest who seeks to research them vanishing under mysterious circumstances. Yet another obscure minor Xenos race, the Nephilim fed on adoration and worship, and converted the native human population of many worlds to a religion centered on themselves, over time consuming the lives of those who worshipped them, and leaving them as desiccated husks. Ultimately, they were wiped out in a joint effort from the Sons of Horus, Blood Angels, and the White Scars. Ian Watson's early 40k books are weird. You have such moments as Imperial fists huffing the fumes of Rogal Dorn's toe amber, chaplains making perfectly spherical shits which are kept in the poop vault, Imperial fist neophytes being branded with the chapter's logo on their massive leathery rumps in front of their new mates, and how could we forget? A massive banquet of mouldy and poisoned food, as well as literal shit, just to check that the recruits' new organs are working as expected. That's all from one book, by the way. The Plague of Unbelief was the name given to the rise of Bucaris, the Cardinal of Gathalamor, who used the confusion that followed the Age of Apostasy to declare himself the mouth of the Emperor, convincing the population of Gathalamor and the surrounding system that Terra was a lost cause, corrupted by traitors and heretics, and their shrine world was the true centre of the Imperial cult. Bucaris would use his position to enrich himself and forge his own cruel empire, though he would ultimately be torn to pieces by a rioting crowd, after making the mistake of publicly torturing and executing an Imperial saint. So that was episode 3 of the 40k lore Iceberg. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you so much. It really does mean a lot. Like, subscribe, all the rest. A huge thank you to my wonderful channel members, Vort, Kraydog, Jewish Dictionary, Tootsicat Meow, Emondo, SP Keating, Celtic99, Cersei, and Victory Kaiser for supporting me. And I will see you all in the next video.